Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about simplicity. Not simplicity as a technique or a goal or another thing to improve yourself toward. Simplicity as a place you can always come back to. The quiet, uncarved state that was here before the world began adding layers, and that is still here under all of them, waiting to be rediscovered. There is a word in Taoist philosophy, pe, that points at this. The uncarved block, the stone before the sculptor begins. Not a lesser state than the finished thing, but in some ways a fuller one, containing all possibilities, committed to none, entirely itself. Across 13 chapters tonight, we will find the uncarved block in many different places, in the sculptor's 3 mornings of simply looking, in the child's maim that predated any label, in the fisherman's bay that offered 60 years of new days to anyone paying attention, in the fog that did not need to clear. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is, where you are listening from, and whether you are a front, back, or side sleeper. There are no wrong answers here, only fellow travelers finding their way to rest. You do not need to know anything about Taoism to be here tonight. These teachings are for anyone who has ever felt the exhaustion of trying to be a more finished version of themselves, and wondered if it was possible, even for one night, to simply be what they already are. So wherever you are right now, let yourself settle in. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night. Let us begin. There is a word in Taoist philosophy, po, that is almost impossible to translate. The closest English approximation is the uncarved block, a piece of wood or stone or jade before any tool has touched it, before anyone has decided what it should become. Lao Tzu wrote about Po as though it were not a beginning state to be outgrown, but a place to return to. He described it as the source of all genuine simplicity, not the simplicity of ignorance, but the simplicity of something that has not yet been diminished by being made into only one thing. The uncarved block is full of possibility precisely because it has not been fixed into any particular shape. The moment the sculptor lifts the chisel, possibility begins to narrow. Something beautiful may emerge, often does, but the block will never again be everything it might have been. We are all, Lao Tzu suggests, carving ourselves continuously, adding layers of performance, expectation, self-improvement, growing more defined, more particular, more finished, and forgetting along the way the quiet wholeness of what we were before all that carving began. Tonight's first teaching is this: the most complete version of you is not the most finished version. It is the version that still contains everything, which is the version that exists right now beneath all the additions. There was a sculptor who had spent 40 years making things beautiful. She had made statues for temples, carvings for homes of the wealthy, small, intricate animals for children. She had enormous skill, and she knew it without arrogance. It was simply the truth of her long practice, the way a river knows its own banks. In her 63rd year, she received a commission for the largest piece she had ever been asked to make, a statue for a great hall, taller than herself. The client had described it in great detail, which way the figure should turn, what expression it should hold, the precise angle of one raised hand. She went to the stone yard to select her block. She stood before a piece of pale stone, taller than she was, unmarked. She placed her hands on it, as she always did at the beginning, feeling the grain. Something stopped her. She stood there for a long time, long enough that the stone yard's owner came to see if she was well. "What do you see?" he asked. "Nothing yet," she said. "That's what I am looking at." The owner did not understand and moved away. She stayed. What she was looking at, what she was trying to hold on to, was the stone exactly as it was, unmarked, uncommitted, full in the way that only unbegun things are full. She had spent 40 years being able to see a finished form inside the raw block. She was trying, for the first time, to not see it, to simply be with what was there before she imposed her vision on it. She returned the next morning, and the next. On the third morning, a young apprentice found her sitting on the ground beside the stone, doing nothing. "Teacher," the apprentice said, "the client has sent another message about the statue." "I know," she said. "When will you begin?" "I've been wondering," she said slowly, "whether the most honest thing I could give him is this stone, exactly as it is." The apprentice looked at the stone, then at her, uncertain. "It is only stone," the apprentice said. "Yes," she said, "but it is still everything before it becomes something. The moment I lift the chisel, that changes. All the things this stone might have been, they will start one by one to disappear. What remains will be beautiful. I've made beautiful things, but I find myself wanting to show this one person what a thing looks like before it has been improved." She made the statue eventually. She was a professional, and the client was kind, and the finished piece was considered among her finest work. The figure had a quality people struggled to name, something unfinished feeling in the best sense, something that seemed to contain more than statues usually did. The apprentice, who watched her work on it every day, noticed that she spent an unusual amount of time simply looking at the stone between cuts, not planning the next cut, just looking, as if she were constantly reminding herself what was still there before she removed it. "What are you doing?" the apprentice asked once during one of these pauses. "Grieving what I'm about to take away," she said, "and being grateful that so much of it is still here." The apprentice carried this through a long career of their own, and taught it in turn to people who never met the sculptor, who passed it forward to people who never met the apprentice. By the time it had traveled 3 generations, no one remembered her name. But the habit remained, standing before the uncarved block, before any tool was raised, simply being with what was complete before the making began. Years later, the apprentice was asked by a student what the most important thing the sculptor had taught was. She considered the question. "She taught me to look before I cut," she said, "and to feel each time that what I was about to remove had as much value as what I was about to create. The looking changed the cutting. I still don't entirely understand why, but it did." In the Japanese Zen tradition, there is a teaching about what practitioners call beginner's mind, the quality of openness that exists before expertise narrows and defines the way we see. The Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki is often credited with a phrase that has traveled far beyond the monastery. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. This is not a criticism of expertise. The sculptor's skill was real and worth having. But Suzuki was pointing at the same thing Lao Tzu pointed at with the uncarved block, that something is present in the undecided state that begins to leave the moment we arrive at a conclusion. Zen training, at its most demanding, is partly an attempt to keep beginner's mind alive alongside growing expertise, to preserve something of the block's openness even after the sculptor has lifted the chisel 1,000 times. There is a specific practice in some Zen traditions of deliberately returning to beginner activities, taking up a craft one knows nothing about, studying a subject with no expectation of mastery, specifically to remember what genuine not knowing feels like in the body, so that the expert can return to that quality intentionally within their own domain. The sculptor in our story spent 3 mornings trying to do exactly this. She was not succeeding in the grand sense. She did make the statue, she did lift the chisel. But for those 3 mornings, she practiced a small and genuine beginner's mind, and it changed what she made, in a way she could feel, even if she could not quite articulate it. Think about something you consider yourself good at. It might be your work, a skill you have developed over years, a way of understanding people, a way of moving through the world. Something you have carved carefully, over a long time, into a reliable and recognizable shape. Now think, when did you last approach that thing with genuine openness, with the sense that you didn't already know what you were going to find? You may have felt this yourself, the way expertise can become a kind of glass between you and what you are actually encountering. You see the category before you see the particular thing. You have the answer before you fully heard the question. The chisel is already lifted. This shows up in ordinary life in small, invisible ways. The conversation you are already partially rehearsing before the other person has finished speaking. The meal tasted through a layer of expectations about what it should taste like. The day evaluated against a template of what a good day looks like, before the day itself has had a chance to be whatever it actually is. There is also this. The uncarved block in yourself is not something you have to go looking for. It is here, now, underneath everything you know about yourself. It has not gone anywhere. You only need to stop looking past it toward the finished version you are trying to maintain. But right now, in this breath, there is nothing you need to already know. This moment has not yet declared what it will contain. You can arrive at it with your hands open, the way the sculptor arrived at the stone. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Before a child is given a name, they are already something. Watch a newborn for long enough and you will begin to see it. A quality that is theirs alone, that has nothing to do with what anyone has yet decided to call them, or who anyone has decided they should become. Something particular and unmistakable, entirely present, entirely itself. Lao Tzu wrote that the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. He was pointing at this, that the deepest thing about any being cannot be adequately captured by any label, role, or description, however carefully applied. The name is useful. The name is not the person. Over a lifetime, we accumulate names: daughter, student, employee, capable, difficult, sensitive, reliable. Each one placed over us by the world, each one partly accurate, each one partly a reduction of something that does not fit cleanly into any category, and somewhere beneath all the names, the original quality is still there, the one that was present before any of them arrived, the one that cannot be fully spoken, only recognized. Tonight's second teaching is this: you were something before you were what you are called. That something has not disappeared. It is still underneath, waiting, as it has always waited, to be rediscovered in the spaces between the names. There was a young woman who had spent most of her life being called the responsible one. It had started early. She was the eldest of 3 children, and she had been given, very young, a quality of steady usefulness that the family had come to rely on. She organized things. She remembered things. She could be counted on. By the time she was 30, responsible had settled around her like a garment worn so long it had become invisible. Not something she put on and took off, but simply how she appeared to everyone, including herself. She liked being reliable. That part was genuinely hers. But she had noticed over the years that when she entered any room, people related to the responsible version of her immediately, before she had done anything, before she had spoken. And she had begun slowly to wonder what was underneath that. What had she been before the label had been applied so firmly that both she and everyone around her had stopped looking further? One summer, she travelled to a part of the country where she knew no one. She had taken a week alone, something she had never permitted herself. She sat by a river the first morning and realized, with a start, that no one she was likely to encounter that day knew she was responsible. No one knew anything about her at all. An old woman came to sit near her on the river bank in the late morning. They sat in companionable quiet for a while before the old woman spoke. "What brought you here?" she asked. It was a simple question, but something in the context, the anonymity, the open day, the absence of anyone who knew her, made the young woman answer it differently than she would have at home. "I'm not entirely sure," she said. "I think I wanted to be somewhere I didn't already know what I was." The old woman looked at her steadily. "You've been called something for a long time," she said. Not a question. "Yes," the young woman said. "Something true, but not the whole of it. And you are trying to find the rest?" "I don't know if I'm trying to find it," the young woman said. "I think I just wanted to stop performing the version people expect, even for a week, even just here." The old woman was quiet for a moment. My granddaughter had a name when she was very small, she said, that she gave herself. Not the name we gave her. Something in her own early sounds that she made before she could speak properly. She would hear it and respond to it as clearly as she responded to her given name. When we called her by her given name, she came. But when we made the sound she had made for herself, she stopped what she was doing and looked at us with an expression I have never been able to describe. Alert, recognized, as if we had found something she had almost forgotten. What happened to that sound? The young woman asked. She grew up, the old woman said simply. Other names arrived. The first one became too small a sound for a world full of proper words. But sometimes, when she is very tired or very relaxed, she will make a version of it without realizing. A sound from before she knew any language. And her face, for just a moment, looks the way it looked when she was 2. The young woman sat with this for a long time. Do you think we all have something like that? She asked. Some version of ourselves from before we were named into a particular shape? I think so, the old woman said. I think the world is full of people who've completely forgotten what theirs was, and a few who haven't entirely. The young woman spent the rest of the week not trying to be anything in particular. She was impractical some days, dawdling over meals, forgetting what time it was. She was occasionally shy, which responsible people were not supposed to be. She was, one afternoon, unreasonably delighted by a particular quality of light on the water that served no purpose and organized nothing. When she returned home, she was still reliable. That quality was genuinely hers, but something in her relationship to the name had changed. She wore it more lightly now, like a coat she could take off at the door rather than a skin. And sometimes, in quiet moments, she could sense something underneath it, something older, something that had no English word, something that simply was. In the Lakota tradition, and across many Plains nations, a person's name is understood as something living, not fixed at birth, but capable of changing as the person themselves changes. A child might receive a childhood name that is later set aside. A warrior might earn a name through action. An elder might be known by a name that reflects what they have become in the community's eyes. Names are understood as descriptions of a living process rather than permanent labels applied once and maintained forever. But there is a deeper teaching that accompanies this understanding of naming. The Lakota concept of wakan, sometimes translated as sacred or holy, but perhaps better understood as mysterious or alive with spirit, suggests that the deepest quality of any person or thing is precisely the quality that cannot be fully named. Wakan is, in a sense, the dimension of being that lies beyond all labeling. Elders in many Plains traditions teach that young people must be helped to remember this quality in themselves, the part of them that predates any description the world has applied, the part that remains when all the descriptions are set aside. This is not seen as navel-gazing or self-involvement. It is seen as the grounding work without which a person cannot be fully useful to their community, because a person who has entirely become their labels has nothing underneath to draw from. The young woman sitting by the river was doing something close to this traditional work, Not in a structured ceremonial way, but in the honest, unplanned way that sometimes produces the same result. Think about the labels you have been wearing longest. Not the ones that were wrong, the ones that were mostly right but still somehow smaller than the full truth. The one that came from your family, the one that came from your work, the one that came from a person who loved you but needed you to be a particular thing, and you became it, and it fit well enough that you never quite checked whether there was more underneath. You may have felt this yourself, the particular relief of being somewhere where no one knows what category to put you in yet. The strange freedom of a first day in a new place. The lightness of a conversation with a stranger who has no prior picture of you to maintain. This shows up in ordinary life in the moment you catch yourself being something you did not choose. Reliable in a way that exhausts you, cheerful in a way that does not match what is actually present, competent in a direction you chose 20 years ago and have never officially unchosen. The label is not wrong, but it is not all of you. Not. But right now, in this breath, you do not have to be what you are called. You are not the most familiar description of yourself tonight. You are something quieter, older, and less defined. Something that was here before the first label arrived. Something that will still be here after all the labels have finally, gradually, been set down. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from being the smartest person in every room. Not the tiredness of effort, the tiredness of armor, but constant maintenance of a position, the alertness required to stay ahead of every challenge, the inability to simply be somewhere without having already prepared a response to everything the somewhere might require of you. Lao Tzu was suspicious of cleverness. He did not distrust intelligence, which is simply the capacity to perceive clearly. He was suspicious of the layer that goes over intelligence, the performed version of it, the version that is always slightly turned toward an audience, always aware of itself as impressive. The uncarved block has no argument to make. It does not need to be the most refined version of anything. It simply is, in the particular way that things simply are before they are decorated with meaning. There is a courage in simplicity that cleverness never quite achieves. The courage to be ordinary. The courage to not have the answer. The courage to let a moment be simple without immediately making it into something more elaborate, more impressive, more worthy of the elaborate person you have spent so much time becoming. Tonight's third teaching is this: the most restful version of yourself is not the sharpest one. It is the one that has stopped needing to prove anything, and discovered in that stopping how much room opens up. There was a philosopher who had made his reputation on arguments. Not aggressive arguments, elegant ones. He had a gift for finding the clearest path through complicated questions, and over many decades had taught and written and spoken his way into a position of considerable respect. people came to him with their most difficult problems. He enjoyed this. He was genuinely good at it. But in his late 50s, something began to happen that he could not immediately name. He would be in conversation, a dinner, a seminar, a walk with a colleague, and he would find himself preparing his next point while the other person was still speaking, not maliciously, automatically. The mechanism had become so well established that it ran without being invited. He was always, at least partially, ahead of where he actually was. He noticed it one evening when his youngest grandchild, a girl of 4, sat beside him and pointed at the sky. "Look," she said. He looked. The sky was doing something with color that had no argument attached to it. It was simply happening. "Yes," he said, and then almost immediately some part of his mind reached for the right thing to say about it, something intelligent, something worth saying, something that would demonstrate that he was not simply a man staring at a sky, but a person with a cultivated relationship to beauty. He stopped himself. The reaching stopped. He sat with the sky and the 4-year-old for a while longer, saying nothing, and noticed something that surprised him. He was uncomfortable. Not bored, uncomfortable. As though simply being present without contributing anything to the moment was somehow dangerous. As though he might disappear if he stopped being useful. He thought about this for several days. He went, eventually, to speak with an old teacher of his, a woman who had known him since his first years of studying, who had made him into much of what he had become. She was very old now and lived simply and received him without ceremony. He told her what had happened, the reaching, the discomfort, the granddaughter, and the sky. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You have learned to do something very well. Now you're afraid that if you stop doing it, even for a moment, there will be nothing left." "Yes," he said, "exactly. But you were something before you could do this," she said. "What was that?" He thought. It had been a long time. "Curious," he said eventually. "Just curious. About everything, without needing to be right about any of it." "Is that quality still in you?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I haven't given it much room." "You have built a very impressive structure on top of it," she said. "The structure is real. The arguments were good. I should know. I helped you make them." She paused. "But a structure that has forgotten the ground it stands on becomes, eventually, afraid of the ground. It stops trusting what it cannot see under the floor." "How do I find it again?" he asked. "You already have, once," she said, "with your granddaughter and the sky. You noticed the reaching. You stopped. That is the whole thing." "It felt like almost nothing," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It usually does. People expect simplicity to feel like a great arrival. It feels much more like being caught doing nothing, which is, more or less, what it is." He sat with her for a while after that, the way he had sat when he was young, before he had anything impressive to contribute. Neither of them spoke much. It was an ordinary hour in a quiet room, and he found himself thinking, for no particular reason, that this was among the better hours he had spent in a very long time. He did not give up his arguments. He was too far into the work of them, and they were still genuinely useful, and he still enjoyed them when he let himself. But he found, slowly, a greater willingness to sit in rooms without immediately making himself useful, to let questions go unanswered, to watch his granddaughter point at things without reaching for the correct response. He noticed over the following months that he was sleeping better. He mentioned this to no one because he could not explain it satisfactorily, but he suspected it had something to do with the reaching, the nightly habitual reaching for the next useful thing to think, having quieted slightly. The mind was doing less work in the hours it was supposed to be resting, and the rest, when it finally arrived, was more genuinely restful for it. The structure remained, but he had found again something of the ground beneath it. In the Stoic tradition, there is a practice sometimes called the reserved act, the deliberate setting aside of one's usual performance in order to see what is actually here. Marcus Aurelius, in his private journals, returned repeatedly to a practice he called stripping away, removing the layers of narrative and importance from whatever he was encountering to see the thing itself, plain and unadorned. He would look at a fine meal and describe it to himself as dead animal and fermented grain, not to diminish the meal, but to free himself from the need to perform the correct response to it. This sounds harsh, but the underlying movement is close to what Lao was describing. The Stoic practice was not about becoming cold or indifferent. It was about reaching through the performance and the meaning-making and the correct response for something more immediate and less adorned. The thing before interpretation, the moment before cleverness. Epictetus, who had been a slave and therefore had very little opportunity for elaborate self-presentation, observed that the philosophers who spoke most beautifully about simplicity were often the ones furthest from it. He preferred the honest admission of not knowing to the elegant demonstration of partial knowing dressed as wisdom. There is a Stoic practice, sometimes called negative visualization, deliberately imagining the loss of what you currently have in order to appreciate it freshly. But there is a related practice that Stoic writers return to more quietly, simply allowing moments to be ordinary without the improvement of commentary. To eat a meal and simply eat it, not as a performance of appreciation or a demonstration of presence, but just as the actual act of eating. To walk and simply walk. To sit and simply sit. The philosopher in our story was, by the time of his conversation with his old teacher, beginning to practice something the Stoics would have recognized, not abandoning his skill, setting it down occasionally long enough to remember what it felt like to stand on the ground before the structure was built. Think about the armor you wear when you are around other people. Not armor in a dramatic sense, the ordinary social armor, the version of yourself that knows how to be impressive or useful or likable, or whatever it is the particular room seems to require, the capability you carry in front of you as an offering. You may have felt this yourself, the exhaustion of a long day spent being appropriately capable. The relief when you finally close a door behind you of not needing to be anything in particular. The strange freedom of being with a child or a very old person or an animal who does not need you to perform anything. This shows up in ordinary life in the reaching, the moment in a conversation where some part of you stops listening and starts preparing, where you are still physically present but already slightly somewhere else, already composing the next useful thing, where the armor is up before you even noticed putting it on. But right now, in this breath, you don't need to be useful. You don't need to be impressive. You don't need to have the right response to this moment. This moment does not need a response. It simply is, the way the sky simply is, and your granddaughter's finger pointing at it simply is, and you, resting here, simply are. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a moment in any deeply learned skill when the technique becomes a problem. Not because the technique was wrong to learn, because the technique, carried too rigidly, begins to put a layer between the practitioner and what they are actually doing. The dancer who counts every step is no longer dancing, they are executing a pattern. The singer who monitors every breath is no longer singing. They are managing a performance. Lao Tzu did not write about dance, but he wrote about the sage who acts without acting, who is so completely in what they are doing that the self-consciousness of doing it disappears. This is wee-wee in its most intimate form. Not the absence of movement, but movement so complete that the mover forgets to watch themselves moving. The uncarved block does not perform being a block. It is not trying to demonstrate the correct qualities of uncarved stone. It simply is those qualities entirely, without any space between the thing and its being. Most of us have learned techniques for living, for relating, for presenting ourselves, and we carry those techniques between us and our actual experience, like a script being performed rather than a life being lived. Tonight's fourth teaching is this: the most alive moments are the ones where you forgot to be anything in particular and simply were fully what you were. There was a dancer who had trained since childhood in a traditional form that required precise, exacting technique. Every movement had a name, every hand position had a meaning, every turn of the head communicated something specific to an audience who knew the vocabulary. She had learned the vocabulary deeply over many years until it was as fluent to her as her own language. She was considered among the finest performers of her generation. Critics praised her precision. Teachers noted her control. She won competitions and received invitations to perform at important events. But privately, she was troubled by something she could not quite articulate, even to herself. She watched footage of her own performances and saw something that the critics did not mention. In every movement there was a tiny fraction of a moment, barely visible, almost imperceptible, where she was checking herself, watching to make sure the hand was in the right place, the head at the right angle, the expression conveying the correct meaning. The checking was invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it. But to her, once she had seen it, it was always there. She sought out an old teacher who had largely retired from teaching but was known to occasionally take a student who needed something different than ordinary instruction. The old teacher watched her practice for an entire afternoon without speaking. At the end of the afternoon, she asked him what he had seen. "A very fine performer," he said. She waited. "Also something else," he said. "What?" "A person who is slightly afraid of her own dancing," he said. She had not expected this. She said nothing for a long moment. "Not afraid of failing," he said. "Afraid of disappearing. There is a difference. If you danced and no one could see you checking, no one but you would relax, but you can still see, and so the checking remains." "How do I stop?" she asked. "You do not stop checking through effort," he said. "You stop by finding something more interesting to pay attention to." He arranged for her to dance in a room with no mirrors and no audience, only himself seated in a corner, not watching her face, but looking at the floor. "Dance something you know so well you could do it asleep," he said. "And while you dance it, find one thing, one small thing you have never noticed before. Something in the space, or in the sound of your own feet, or in the way the air moves around a particular gesture. Something that you could not have known to look for in advance." She began to dance. She knew the sequence deeply, and the checking began almost immediately. The small habitual monitoring she could now feel as clearly as a pebble in a shoe. Then she found something. The way the lamplight caught the edge of one sleeve at a specific moment in the sequence. A tiny, specific, unrepeatable quality of light she had never paid attention to before because she had always been looking at herself in the mirror. She followed it. The checking did not disappear, but it grew quieter. The lamp, the sleeve, the particular second of light, these were more interesting than the monitoring, and the monitoring subsided the way background noise subsides when something genuinely absorbs you. When she finished, the old teacher was quiet for a moment. "What did you find?" he asked. She told him about the light and the sleeve. He nodded. "Good. Come back next week," he said. "Find something different. Not the sleeve, not the light, something you have not yet looked for." She understood then that this was not a technique so much as a practice of returning repeatedly to genuine attention, the same quality that had been there before the technique was built, which the technique had inadvertently obscured. Each time she found something new, something she could not have planned to find. And each time, the finding gradually crowded out the monitoring, not by defeating it, but by simply being more interesting. Her performances changed. Critics began using different words. Where before they had praised precision and control, they now wrote about something less definable, a quality of presence, of genuine inhabiting. A sense that the dancer was not showing them the dance, but actually fully inside it. She never lost her technique. She had trained too long and too deeply for that. But she had found something underneath the technique, something that had been there before the technique was laid down, and had waited quietly all those years for her to notice it again. In Hindu philosophical tradition, particularly within the devotional practices associated with bhakti yoga, the path of love and surrender, there is a distinction drawn between sahaja, spontaneous or natural expression, and learned, performed expression. The highest aspiration in many bhakti traditions is sahaja samadhi, a state of absorption so complete that the distinction between the practitioner and the practice dissolves. Not the performance of devotion, but the actual being of it. Not the display of love, but its living. The great devotional poets, Mirabai, Kabir, Tukaram, wrote about this state as something that sometimes arrived unexpectedly, when the effort of performing the correct devotion was briefly abandoned. Mirabai, particularly, wrote about moments of such complete absorption in her devotion that she forgot entirely who was watching, or that there was anyone to watch, and something that felt like truth arrived in exactly that unguarded moment. There is a related teaching in several devotional traditions about the difference between shraddha, sincere, wholehearted engagement, and mere performance of the required forms. Both may look identical from the outside. Only the practitioner, and sometimes not even they, can feel the difference. But the teaching holds that the sincerity produces something the performance cannot, regardless of how technically correct the performance might be. The dancer in our story was pursuing a secular version of the same thing, what the bhakti traditions call sahaja, naturalness, spontaneity, the quality that appears when performance is forgotten, is very close to what Lao Tzu meant by the uncarved block in action. Not the removal of skill, the removal of the watching self that monitors the skill and keeps the skill from being entirely itself. Think about something you do that you love, and think about when you love it most. It is probably not the moments when you are most technically correct. It is probably the moments when you forgot to monitor yourself, when you were so absorbed in what was happening that the checking fell away, and whatever you were doing simply happened through you rather than being constructed by you. You may have felt this yourself, the conversation that felt real precisely because you forgot to manage it. The piece of writing that surprised you, the gain you won by not trying to win, the day that turned beautiful because you stopped planning it. This shows up in ordinary life in the small, persistent checking we carry into almost everything. The performance of being a good guest, a good friend, a good parent, that occasionally obscures the actual being of those things. The technique that has so thoroughly colonized the experience that the experience is now just the technique, and we cannot remember what it was like before we learned to do it correctly. Not, but. Right now, in this breath, there is nothing to perform. No one needs you to be the correct version of a person falling asleep. You can simply be here, not demonstrating rest, not displaying quiet, just here, whatever this actually is. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a kind of self-improvement that begins to resemble its opposite. The person who works very hard at becoming calmer, who strives intensely to be less driven, who achieves, through tremendous effort, a temporary appearance of ease that costs more energy than the original anxiety. Lao Tzu noticed this paradox. He wrote that the person who knows does not speak, and the person who speaks does not know, which is not a condemnation of speaking, but an observation about the gap between the performance of a quality and the thing itself. The truly patient person is not performing patience. They're simply not hurrying. The uncarved block does not try to be uncarved. It has never had the option of being otherwise. But we, who have been carved into all manner of shapes, can become so focused on carving ourselves back towards something simpler that the carving never stops. We add practice simplicity to the list of things we must do and improve and optimize. We improve our way away from improvement. The deepest simplicity is not achieved. It is stumbled upon, usually in the moments when we have given up trying and simply find ourselves, unexpectedly, already there. Tonight's fifth teaching is this: the part of you that cannot meditate correctly, cannot improve fast enough, cannot perform the spiritual practice right, that part may be closer to the uncarved block than anything you have successfully performed. There was a monk who was considered, by everyone who knew him, the worst meditator in the monastery. He had been there for 9 years. He had sat in formal practice for thousands of hours, and in every session, without fail, his mind wandered, not gently wandered, galloped. Within moments of closing his eyes, he was in a market, a memory, an argument, a fantasy, a list of concerns, both real and invented. The bell would ring to signal the end of practice, and he would return from somewhere entirely elsewhere, vaguely ashamed. He had been given instructions by several teachers. He had tried counting breaths, labeling thoughts, following the sensations in his body, returning again and again to a single point. Each technique failed in its own way. His mind was, as he had come to think of it, simply not built for this. He considered leaving the monastery. He was not sure what had kept him there for 9 years. Stubbornness, perhaps? The absence of a better plan? A faint hope that something would eventually change. One spring, a new teacher arrived, an elderly woman who was said to have practiced in several different traditions and to teach in an unusually direct way. She sat with each monk individually, and when she sat with him, she asked him to describe what happened when he tried to meditate. He told her honestly. The wandering, the galloping, the complete ongoing failure. She listened without any expression that suggested he had said something problematic. "And what do you do when you notice the mind has wandered?" she asked. "I return," he said. "I try to return anyway, to the breath or to whatever I was supposed to be with." "And how do you feel about the wandering itself?" she asked. He thought about this. "Frustrated," he said, "resigned, a little embarrassed, like someone who cannot learn something that everyone around them finds relatively easy." "Tell me," she said, "what it feels like in the exact moment when you realize you have wandered." He sat with this. He had never been asked this specific question. "There is a moment," he said slowly, "when I realize I've been gone. Before the frustration, just a moment of recognition. I was somewhere else, and now I'm here again." "What is that moment like?" she asked. "Plain," he said after a long pause. "Just plain. Not especially anything. I was there, Now I am here. She nodded, and he had the feeling she had been waiting for this. That moment, she said, is exactly what practice is for. He stared at her. The wandering is not the failure, she said. The wandering is ordinary mind, doing what ordinary mind does. The frustration and embarrassment are also ordinary. Another layer of mind commenting on the first layer. But that plain, simple moment of noticing, that moment of just being here without any additional commentary yet, that is what the practice is pointing toward. You have been experiencing it thousands of times and calling it failure. It feels like nothing, he said. Yes, she said, that is what it feels like. He sat with this for a while. He was a man who trusted what he could verify, and this, the plain moment of return, was something he had in fact been experiencing consistently and reliably for 9 years. He had simply never thought to count it as anything. If this is the thing, he said slowly, then I have been succeeding for 9 years. Yes, she said, rather a lot, actually. He sat for a moment with the unfamiliar feeling of that. He continued to meditate, badly, as always, in the weeks that followed. The mind continued to gallop, but he began paying attention to the moment she had named, the instant before frustration arrived, the plain, bare recognition of having returned. And he found, to his surprise, that it was not nothing. It was very simple and very quiet, and it had no quality of achievement about it whatsoever, and it was there every single time, more reliable than anything else in the practice. The teacher had shown him that what he had been calling failure was simply the practice, repeated plainly thousands of times without decoration. He was still the worst meditator in the monastery, but he had stopped being ashamed about it, and something in his face changed in a way that people noticed without being able to say what it was. In Buddhist tradition, there is a teaching sometimes given to students who feel they are failing in their practice, a teaching about the beginner's mind that carries, beneath its simplicity, something quite radical. The Zen tradition, in particular, warns against what is sometimes called spiritual materialism, the tendency to treat spiritual practice as another domain in which to accumulate, achieve, and improve. The practitioner who is collecting experiences of insight, who measures their progress by dramatic states of consciousness, who is building an impressive spiritual resume, is still very much in the grip of the same acquisitive, achieving mind they set out to transcend. The meditation teacher Choi Gyam Trungpa wrote about this pattern extensively. He observed that the spiritual path was full of people who had become extremely sophisticated in their self-deception, who had learned through years of practice to present a version of spiritual accomplishment that was largely performance. Against this, the simple, plain, undramatic moment of noticing, of returning from wandering to presence, carries a kind of integrity that the impressive spiritual performance rarely does. It is not dramatic. It does not feel like an achievement. It is just the bare fact of being here again, without story. There is also a teaching, sometimes offered in Theravada Buddhist traditions, about the way the mind that is not straining toward any particular state of consciousness is often freer than the mind urgently seeking liberation. The urgency itself creates a kind of tension that prevents the very openness it is looking for. The monk who has given up hoping for a special experience, who has settled into the plain returning practice, often discovers, without effort and without drama, exactly what years of hopeful striving had failed to produce. The monk in our story, by his 9th year, had accumulated 9 years of this. Thousands of plain, undramatic returns. He had mistaken them for failure. The teacher showed him they were the work itself. There is also a teaching in the Zen tradition about what is sometimes called just sitting, shikantaza, which describes a form of meditation so completely free of agenda, so stripped of any goal or aim, that it cannot really be called a technique at all. The practitioner simply sits. Whatever arises, arises. Whatever passes, passes. There is no correct experience being aimed for. There is only the sitting, completely, in whatever this is. This sounds easy. It is considered in many Zen lineages the most advanced practice, precisely because it offers the ego nothing to hold on to, nothing to achieve, no drama of progress, no consolation of apparent failure, just the plain, undramatic fact of being here, which is, the tradition says, entirely sufficient, which has always been entirely sufficient, which was sufficient 9 years ago and is equally sufficient now. Think about something you are trying to improve about yourself, and think honestly about whether the improvement project has become its own kind of burden. You may have felt this yourself. The self-development plan that has quietly turned into another arena of self-criticism. The mindfulness practice that makes you anxious about whether you are being mindful correctly. The effort to be more present that keeps pulling you into the future, where you imagine being more present than you currently are. This shows up in ordinary life in the exhausting project of continuous self-optimization. Always reading the book, always applying the lesson, always measuring progress, always finding yourself slightly short of the person you are working to become. The carving never stops. Not achieving simplicity through effort. Right now, in this breath, you don't need to meditate correctly. You don't need to relax in the right way. You don't need to demonstrate that tonight's practice is working. You only need to notice, simply, plainly, without any additional commentary, that you are here. That is the whole of it. It has been here the whole time. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a pressure in many lives to fill the silence with words, the empty space with furniture, the blank calendar with commitments, the unanswered question with an answer, any answer, because the absence of an answer feels like failure. Lao Tzu was deeply comfortable with empty. He wrote about the value of the space inside the wheel, the hollow of the cup, the opening of a door. He was not recommending blankness. He was pointing at the generative poverty of space. That which is not yet filled has the capacity to be filled with exactly what is needed. That which is already full can receive nothing more. The uncarved block, again. Before the words arrive, before the furniture is arranged, before the answer is supplied, there is a moment of genuine openness that is not the absence of something, but the presence of possibility. The person who cannot tolerate that moment, who rushes to fill it before discovering what it contains, never finds out what it was going to hold. Tonight's sixth teaching is this. The willingness to leave something empty is not a failure of contribution. It may be the highest form of it. There was a rabbi famous throughout the region for sermons of unusual depth. Every week, community members gathered from considerable distances to hear him speak. He had a gift for connecting the ancient texts to the particular difficulties of ordinary contemporary life. Not in abstract ways, but precisely in ways that made people feel genuinely understood. He had been doing this for 30 years, and his community trusted him completely. One Shabbat morning, he arrived at the bima, the raised platform from which he spoke, and found that the words he had prepared had entirely left him. He stood for a moment, reaching for the opening of his sermon, and found nothing there. Not uncertainty, absence. The careful, considered thoughts he had brought with him had dissolved, as cleanly as if they had never existed. He stood in the silence for what felt to him like a very long time. The congregation waited. They trusted him. They assumed this was deliberate. After a while, he sat down. He did not speak. The silence continued. After some minutes, he raised his eyes to the congregation. He opened his mouth once, found nothing, and closed it again. The silence grew. People shifted slightly. One or two coughed. Someone turned a page out of habit and stopped. The silence, which had first seemed like discomfort, began to change quality. The way eyes adjust to a dark room, the congregation began to notice what was in it, what the usual sermon had been filling. Some found themselves thinking about the person beside them in an actual way, not the comfortable abstraction of them as fellow congregant. Some found themselves thinking about something they had not allowed themselves to think about in a long time. One person in the congregation, an old woman who had known him for 20 of his 30 years, began to weep quietly. Not from distress, from something else that she could not have explained. Someone else across the room made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a word, a release of something held. The rabbi remained seated. The silence remained. Eventually, at the moment when a sermon would ordinarily have ended, he rose, made the closing blessing, and the service concluded. The conversation afterward was unlike anything the community had experienced. People spoke to each other differently, more carefully, more honestly. Several people said things they had been unable to say before that morning, without being able to explain why the morning had made it possible. The old woman who had wept sought him out. "What were you doing?" she asked. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "I had a sermon, and then I didn't. And you chose not to find something to say instead." "I thought about it," he said. "For a moment I thought, I'll say something about the silence itself, some prepared thought about the value of silence. And then I realized that if I did that, the silence would be gone. The only way to honor it was to stay in it. It was the most useful thing you have ever done, she said. He thought about this for a long time afterward. He was a man of words. Words were his craft and his gift, and, he now suspected, also one of the ways he had learned to keep himself at a comfortable distance from the thing he was always trying to say. The sermon was between him and the direct encounter. The sermon was what he offered instead of himself. The silence had been him, with nothing between him and the congregation, or himself. He did not stop giving sermons. He was a rabbi, and sermons were part of the work. But he began building silences into them, not as technique, not as a device to create effect, but as honest moments of not knowing, of arriving at the edge of what he could say and choosing, briefly, to simply stand there. He noticed over the years that these silences were the parts of his sermons people remembered most. Not the elegant arguments, not the precise connections between old text and contemporary life, the pauses, the moments when he had clearly run out of prepared things to say and had simply been present in the absence of them. Something happened in those moments that his most careful words did not produce, something that could only arrive in a space that was genuinely empty rather than efficiently filled. The congregation felt the difference. They could not have explained why his sermons had changed, only that they now felt, occasionally, like an uncarved block rather than a finished piece, as though something in them had room to be whatever it needed to be, rather than being shaped by someone else's intended conclusion. In Hasidic tradition, the teaching of Torah, the study and transmission of sacred text, is understood as far more than an intellectual exercise. It is considered a form of encounter, a meeting between the student or listener and something that cannot be fully contained in any words. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, taught that the spaces between the letters of the Torah were as sacred as the letters themselves. He was not speaking only of the physical text. He was pointing at the principle that the unsaid is not the absence of meaning, but often its most concentrated form. There is a Hasidic teaching that sometimes the most powerful thing a teacher can do is to say nothing, to create a space in which the student must encounter their own understanding rather than receiving the teacher's understanding and storing it away. The student who has been given all the answers has no need to find anything. The student who has been given a well-prepared silence has been given the occasion to discover. The rabbi in our story stumbled into this accidentally. He had not planned to teach through silence, but the silence taught more effectively than his usual careful words, precisely because it was genuine. It was not performed emptiness. It was real not knowing, real standing at the edge, and the congregation felt the difference immediately. There is also a related teaching about the role of the Shabbat itself, the weekly cessation of creation, of labor, of the filling of the world with human making, as a practice of honoring the space between, not doing less in order to do more later, simply allowing 1 day in 7 for something other than human productivity to occupy the world. Think about a space you have been filling that might not need to be filled. Not because filling is wrong, because the fill-in sometimes prevents you from discovering what the space was actually trying to be. You may have felt this yourself, the question answered before it was fully asked, the pause in conversation jumped into before the other person had finished thinking, the evening scheduled so that silence doesn't have a chance to arrive uninvited. This shows up in ordinary life in the discomfort of unscheduled time. The afternoon with nothing arranged, the dinner with no topic decided in advance, the moment of quiet in a conversation that makes you reach automatically for something to say, as though the silence were a problem requiring immediate solution rather than a presence offering something. There is also the internal version, the impulse to fill the moment between one thought and the next with the next thought before the first has fully settled, the mind that can barely complete an idea before beginning the next one. Not. But right now in this breath, there is nothing you need to say, nothing you need to supply. The silence of this room at this hour is not empty in the way a failed thing is empty. It is full of whatever is actually here, your breathing, your rest, the dark, the night. You do not need to fill it. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a tradition in certain old crafts of deliberately leaving something unfinished, a small flaw woven in, a thread left loose, a corner not quite completed, not from carelessness, from intention, from the understanding that a thing perfectly finished is in some sense already dead. That what makes something alive in the deepest sense is that it still has somewhere to go. Lao Tzu wrote that great perfection appears imperfect, and that great straightness appears bent. He was not praising sloppiness, he was pointing at something more unsettling, that our ideas of perfection, of completion, of finishedness, often describe a kind of death rather than a fullness. The uncarved block is perfect in a way that no carved thing can be, because it has not yet been narrowed by completion. Every finished thing has given up its becoming. The half-finished thing, the thread left loose, has not. It still contains a gesture toward what might yet happen. We are full of finished stories about ourselves. I am this kind of person. I am done with that. I have arrived at this position and I am holding it. The completion is real, but it also closes. Tonight's seventh teaching is this: the deliberately left loose thread is not evidence of failure. It is the opening through which the next thing enters. There was a weaver known in her village for tapestries of great beauty and considerable complexity. She had learned the craft from her grandmother, who had learned it from hers, in an unbroken line of women who had passed the particular patterns and techniques of their region from hand to hand across many generations. The patterns were elaborate. The finished tapestries told stories, the histories of families, the movements of seasons, the relationships between the village and the landscape it had occupied for centuries. She worked on a large piece for nearly a year. one she had been planning for much longer. It depicted the founding of the village, the planting of the first fields, the building of the first stone walls. She had researched it carefully, gathered testimony from the oldest members of the community, made studies and revisions and more studies. When it was nearly complete, she stopped. She had one corner left, perhaps 2 weeks of work, and she found she could not bring herself to finish it. She sat with this for a while, thinking it was simply tiredness, or the reluctance that comes at the end of a long project, but it persisted. An old friend came to visit, someone who had known her grandmother, and who carried some of the old teaching more deliberately than most. She showed him the unfinished corner. "What is in that corner?" he asked. "I've planned the design for it," she said. "Everything is decided. I know exactly what goes there." "Then what stops you?" She thought carefully. I think finishing it feels like," she paused, "like closing the story, like saying, this is what happened, definitively, completely, and nothing can be added." "And do you want to say that?" he asked. "No," she said, surprising herself. "I don't think I do. The village is still here. The story is still happening. The people who founded it have grandchildren who are still discovering what they planted." He looked at the tapestry for a long time. "Your grandmother," he said, "used to leave a loose thread in every piece she made, never in the same place twice, sometimes visible, sometimes not. She called it the breathing hole. I remember," she said, "I asked her once why she did it. She said every finished thing needs a door left open." "Yes," he said, "not because the craft was incomplete, because the story is." She looked at the unfinished corner differently now. She did not finish it in the way she had planned. Instead, she wove a section that was clearly incomplete, not slovenly, not unintentional, but deliberately, carefully unresolved. A pattern begun and not concluded, a question posed in thread, with no answer provided. When the tapestry was displayed, this corner generated more conversation than any other part of it. People stood before it and talked about what the unfinished pattern might mean, what the continuation might look like, how the story might go from here. The tapestry had become, in its incompleteness, a living thing, still asking rather than declaring. She made this a practice after that. Every piece she made had something left open, sometimes large, sometimes almost invisible. Always deliberate, always the breathing hole. "How will people know it's intentional?" an apprentice asked her once. "They won't, always," she said. "That's fine. The work knows." Over the years, she found that people were drawn back to her tapestries in a way they had not been to her earlier, perfectly finished work. Visitors to the hall where her largest pieces hung would spend time standing before them, returning on different days, each time finding something they had not noticed before. The finished pieces had communicated everything they had to communicate in a single viewing. The pieces with the breathing hole kept offering something new. She thought about this often, about how the incompleteness she had initially feared as weakness had become the quality that gave the work its most genuine life, about how the thread left loose was, in some way, the conversation she was still having with whoever encountered the piece. A finished conversation is finished. An open one continues. She never publicized this practice. It was not a technique she recommended. It was simply what she did, because it was what she had learned the work needed. Some pieces needed to breathe, and she had learned to trust that need, even when the expected thing would have been to tie off the thread and declare the piece complete. In the Celtic wisdom traditions of the British Isles and Ireland, there is a long and quiet practice of what scholars sometimes call deliberate imperfection, the intentional inclusion of something unfinished, flawed, or open-ended in a completed work. This appears in Celtic knotwork, where careful examination of certain traditional patterns reveals what appear to be errors that are, upon deeper investigation, intentional. In Gaelic oral tradition, certain stories were understood to have no ending, not because the tradition had forgotten the ending, but because the story was considered to be ongoing, still alive in the telling, not yet concluded. The concept behind these practices is related to the idea that a perfectly closed thing is a dead thing, that what makes a work or a story or a life genuinely alive is that it remains in some relationship with what is not yet decided. There is a related teaching in some Celtic traditions about the weaver who includes a flaw so that the spirit of the work can breathe out, not mysticism, but a practical understanding of how finished things can become airless. This is very close to what Lao Tzu was pointing at with the uncarved block. The block's value is not merely that it has not been carved. It is that, because it has not been carved, it is still fully in conversation with what it might become. The weaver's loose thread holds something of this quality in an otherwise finished piece, a small door kept open in the wall of the completed work. Think about something in your life you have been trying to finish, to conclude, to resolve, to bring to a point of clear completion. Not because finishing is wrong, some things need finishing, but consider whether the drive to complete this particular thing is serving the thing, or serving your discomfort with openness. You may have felt this yourself. The compulsion to resolve a relationship into a clear category when the relationship is actually still in the process of becoming something. The need to have a final position on a question but genuinely has not yet declared its answer. The frustration with a situation that is simply still unfinished and cannot be anything else yet. This shows up in ordinary life in the restlessness before a decision has been made, the inability to simply inhabit the uncertainty while it resolves at its own pace. The conversation conducted repeatedly in the head, trying to arrive at a conclusion it is not yet time to reach. The story about yourself pushed toward a final form that the actual living of your life has not yet validated. There is a particular kind of peace available only in the unfinished state, available to anyone willing to stop requiring it to be something else. The weaver's loose thread is not a flaw waiting to be corrected. It is the breathing hole, and it is breathing. Not, but. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to resolve anything. You can be, in this moment, exactly as unfinished as you actually are. That unfinishedness is not failure. It is the breathing hole. It is the place where tomorrow's becoming will enter. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a version of self-improvement that is actually a form of self-rejection. The project is vast and endless. Every book, every practice, every changed habit is aimed at producing a version of yourself that is finally acceptable, finally good enough to stop needing to be improved. But this version never quite arrives. There is always more to optimize, more to learn, more to eliminate. Lao Tzu wrote that the sage does not accumulate. The more they give, the more they have. He was describing a paradox that applies here. The person who stops trying to improve is often the one who genuinely grows. Because growth, like the tree, happens naturally in the right conditions. It cannot be forced, and the forcing often prevents it. The uncarved block is not engaged in a project of self-improvement. It is simply what it is, in full. And its fullness, its complete, uncompromised whatness, is precisely what gives it so much potential for what it might become. We have confused becoming with improving. Becoming is natural. It happens in the warmth of genuine living, of actual encounter, of real feeling. Improving is a managed project, an anxiety-driven carving that often produces something more controlled but less alive. Tonight's 8th teaching is this. The relief of stopping the self-improvement project is not a defeat. It is the beginning of the actual becoming that the project was always pretending to produce. There was a woman who had been improving herself for 20 years. It had begun with a book about morning routines, which had led to a journal, which had led to a meditation practice, which had led to dietary changes, which had led to extensive reading about sleep, which had led to more books, more practices, more carefully monitored habits. She had filled more notebooks than she could fit on a single shelf. She had made and remade her personal vision statement 4 times. She was, by most external measures, very accomplished. She had also, by her own assessment, a great deal still left to improve. She was sitting on a bench in a park one afternoon, reading a new book about emotional regulation, when she looked up and saw a small child running toward her pigeons with pure, undiluted delight. The child ran. The pigeons scattered. The child laughed. The pigeons returned. The child ran again. There was nothing to be learned from this, nothing to be optimized, no technique being applied, just a small person in complete, uncomplicated relationship with the present moment. The woman set down her book. She sat for a long time without reading. Something in her was very tired, and she had not noticed until just now. Not tired in the way that sleep fixes, tired in the way of a person who has been managing a very large, very complicated project for a very long time without ever reaching the end of it. A woman sat down beside her, older, perhaps 70, with an ease in her body that suggested she had long since arrived somewhere. "What are you reading?" the older woman asked, nodding toward the abandoned book. Something about managing emotions better, she said. How is that working for you? The older woman asked, with genuine curiosity and no judgment. I have learned a great deal, the woman said, choosing her words carefully. I am much more skilled than I was. But, the older woman said, she thought about the child and the pigeons. I'm not sure I enjoy myself any more than I did before I started. The older woman nodded slowly. What did you enjoy before all this? She tried to remember. It had been a long time. I liked just being somewhere, without an agenda for it. When did that stop? The older woman asked. I started reading a book about mindfulness, she said. And then I was being somewhere, but I was also evaluating how mindfully I was being there. And then, I don't know. The agenda arrived and didn't leave. You were improving your presence, the older woman said. Yes, you improved yourself out of it. She looked at the child who had stopped running and was now sitting very still, watching an ant cross the path in front of her, entirely absorbed, entirely present, not improving anything. What do I do? She asked. The same thing she's doing, the older woman said. But you probably won't be able to simply decide to do it, because the project will tell you you're doing it wrong. Then how? You tire of the project, the older woman said simply. Eventually the project exhausts itself. You will put down the book one day, as you have today, and simply not pick it up again. Not because you have given up, because you have arrived somewhere that the book was trying to point toward and found it was available without the book. The woman sat in the park for a long time after the older woman left. She did not pick up the book again that afternoon. She watched the child, and then watched a dog, and then watched clouds move over the far end of the park, and did not produce any useful thoughts about any of it. On the bus home, she had an impulse to note something in her journal. She thought about it, and then simply watched the streets pass outside the window instead. She noticed something she had not noticed in a long time, that she actually enjoyed watching streets pass. It required nothing of her. It went nowhere. It produced nothing that could be measured or reported or reflected on afterward. It was simply pleasant. She had forgotten, somewhere in the long project of becoming a better version of herself, that she was allowed to simply enjoy things, that the enjoyment did not need to be noted or analyzed or converted into insight, that a bus window and a moving street could simply be exactly what they were, and she could simply be exactly where she was, and no improvement of any kind was required. That night she slept more easily than she had in years. She could not have said why. She did not abandon her practices entirely. Some of them had become genuinely hers, comfortable habits rather than anxious obligations. But she stopped acquiring new ones. She stopped measuring herself against the next version she was supposed to be becoming. And something in that stopping produced exactly the quality she had been trying to improve herself toward for 20 years. A simple, sustainable ease with being who she already was. In the Sufi tradition of Islamic mysticism, there is a teaching about the stages of the spiritual path that contains a warning that practitioners do not often hear early enough. Among the stages typically described in classical Sufi teaching, there is a transition that is sometimes called the passage from murid to murad, from the one who seeks to the one who is sought. The seeker is the person in active, often anxious, pursuit of spiritual development. The sought is the person who has, through some combination of sincere effort and genuine exhaustion of that effort, arrived at a state of simply being available rather than actively striving. The Sufi teachers emphasize that this transition cannot be engineered. The striving stage is necessary. It is not bypassed. But the striving eventually has to surrender itself for the next stage to begin. And that surrender looks, from the outside and often from the inside too, like giving up. Rumi wrote about this with characteristic directness. The effort is real, the effort is necessary, and the effort must eventually be consumed. The fire burns the seeker, and what remains is not the seeker, but the sought. Something simpler, less defended, less anxious, available to what is actually here, rather than perpetually reaching for the next improvement. There is also a Sufi concept sometimes described as hal, a state that arrives momentarily unbidden as a gift rather than an achievement. Moments of genuine presence, genuine peace, genuine contact with what is real. The Sufi understanding is that hal cannot be produced by effort. It can only be received, and is most likely to arrive precisely when the striving has temporarily exhausted itself. The woman who stopped improving herself was not abandoning the path. She was, if anything, beginning to walk it more honestly, without the mediation of the project. Think about the self-improvement project you are currently running. Not to criticize it, some of it may be genuinely useful, genuinely yours. But notice, is any part of it rooted more in self-rejection than in genuine care? Is any part of it producing a managed performance of improvement rather than an actual change in how you experience being alive? You may have felt this yourself, the satisfaction of completing the improvement task that is immediately replaced by awareness of the next one. The exhaustion of being always slightly behind the version you are supposed to be becoming. The vague suspicion that all this self-development is somehow making you less rather than more at ease. This shows up in ordinary life in the monitoring, the ongoing background evaluation of how well you are performing your own life. The check-in with the vision statement. The assessment of whether this response was the emotionally mature one, the comparison between today's version of yourself and the one you are trying to become. Not, but resting in what you already are, which was always available beneath the project. Right now, in this breath, there is nothing to improve. You are not a project tonight. You are a person, lying in the dark, breathing, exactly as alive as you are. That is already enough. It was always enough. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Before the calendar, there was still time. There was the morning and the evening, the wet season and the dry, the moon's cycle and the sun's, the body's rhythms which knew when to sleep and when to wake before anyone had given those states official names. Lao Tzu wrote very little about time directly, but what he wrote was consistent with the Tao's deeper teaching, that what is natural does not need to be measured to be real, that the pulse does not need to be counted to be functioning, that the tree does not need to be told what season it is in order to lose its leaves or grow them back. We have added to the natural cycles of our lives an extraordinary quantity of measurement, scheduling, tracking, and comparison. We know how productive this hour was. We know how we measure against our own previous versions. We know to the minute how late we are for the next thing we have decided to do. And this knowledge, which is not wrong, can crowd out a different, older kind of knowing. The knowing of the body in a particular season, the knowing of the heart in a particular kind of day, the knowing that does not require a number to be real. Tonight's 9th teaching is this: before all the measuring began, there was something here, something quiet and unhurried and already whole. It is still here, under all the numbers. There was a young man from a city who went to spend a month in a remote mountain village with a distant relative he had never met. He had scheduled exactly when he would exercise, when he would work on a project he had brought with him, when he would sleep. His relative, an old man who lived alone and had lived in the same place all his long life, observed the young man's first 2 days with quiet interest. On the 3rd morning, the young man arrived at breakfast looking somewhat agitated. "I didn't get up at the right time," he said. "The right time for what?" his relative asked. "I usually exercise at 7, the young man said. "I slept until 8:30. "Were you tired?" the old man asked. "I suppose," the young man admitted. "Then 8:30 was the right time," the old man said. The young man looked at him. "But I had a schedule." The old man served the eggs without commenting further. The young man sat with this uncomfortably for a moment. He had never before this trip thought of 8:30 as anything other than wrong, given his schedule. But he was genuinely not sure he could articulate why it was wrong, other than the fact that 7 was the number he had written down. The young man noticed over the following days that his relative did not appear to use a clock or a watch. He woke when he woke. He ate when he was hungry. He worked in his garden during the part of the day that felt correct for it, and rested during another part, and ate again when the light and his body agreed that it was time. "How do you know when to do things?" the young man asked him finally. The old man thought about this genuinely. "I pay attention," he said, "to the light, to how the body feels, to what seems ready, the garden, the food, myself. Things tell you when they are ready, if you are paying attention to them. What if they don't agree? What if the garden needs work, but the body is tired?" "Then I must decide," the old man said, "like anyone. But I decide based on what is actually true, not based on what a number says I am supposed to be doing at this particular moment." The young man was quiet. "I feel like if I gave up the schedule," he said, "nothing would get done." "Has everything gotten done today?" the old man asked. The young man looked around. The breakfast had been made, the dishes were clean, the firewood was stacked. He had, he realized, done a considerable amount that morning, following the old man's example rather than his schedule. "Yes," he said. "Did it require a schedule?" He thought about it honestly. No, the old man refilled the cups. I am not telling you that schedules are bad, he said. In a city with many people and many tasks that must be coordinated, schedules are useful. But you are not in a city now. You are here. And here the day already knows what it needs. You only have to listen. The young man spent the remaining weeks in the village in an experiment. He put his phone away. He did not look at the time. He slept when he was tired, ate when he was hungry, worked when the work called, and sat in the sun when nothing called at all. He did not keep his exercise schedule. He also walked considerably more than he usually did, simply because walking felt good in that air, at that altitude, in that season. He did not finish the project he had brought. He also had 3 long conversations with his relative about the old man's life and the history of the family and things the young man had never known and would not have stopped to hear if he had been tracking his productivity. When he returned to the city, he did not give up his schedule. The city required it. But something in his relationship to it had changed. He wore it more lightly. He could feel now the difference between the schedule's sense of what needed to happen and his body's sense. And he had learned in the mountain that the body's sense was at least as reliable and considerably more honest. In the Mayan cosmological tradition, time is understood not as a neutral container for events, but as a living quality that varies, that has texture, energy, and character. The Maya developed one of the most sophisticated calendar systems in human history. But this complexity served a purpose quite different from our own. Not the measurement of time as a resource to be managed and allocated, but the understanding of time as a presence to be worked with, to be read for its qualities, to be honored according to its particular nature in any given moment. Within this understanding, certain days carry certain energies. The question is not how much time do I have, but what kind of time is this? The Maya calendar was not a tool for squeezing more productivity into each unit. It was a tool for recognizing what each unit of time was actually offering. There is also a Mayan understanding of rest itself as having its own character and requirement, not simply the absence of work, but a specific kind of time with its own quality, to be honored as such rather than merely used to recover capacity for future productivity. The person who cannot truly rest, who uses rest only as a means to the next working period, has not yet understood what rest actually is. This understanding is, in a sense, the sophisticated inverse of what the young man's relative was teaching him. The old man was pointing at a primal, embodied relationship with time, the body's relationship with the natural cycles that exist beneath and before any calendar. The Mayan tradition was pointing at an elevated, carefully observed relationship with those same cycles, but still a relationship of listening rather than management. Both traditions share the underlying conviction that time is not simply the neutral medium through which we move. It has character, it speaks, and the person who listens to it, rather than imposing their schedule upon it, often discovers that the day already knows what it needs. Think about when you last spent time without measuring it. Not managed time, not productive time, not time spent toward a goal. Just time, as it actually was, without assessment. You may have felt this yourself, the rare afternoon that simply happened, that had no official purpose, that turned into something you could not have planned and did not need to evaluate afterward. The morning that unfolded without any sense of whether it was going correctly. The conversation that lasted as long as it lasted, not according to what you had allocated. This shows up in ordinary life in the tyranny of the scheduled unit. The hour that must justify itself. The day evaluated against its projected version. The life assessed quarterly against the goals set in January. We are not, most of us, actually living in the days. We are living in the assessment of the days, which is not the same place at all. Not. But take the day show you what it actually contains. Right now, in this breath, there is no time to manage. This moment is not a unit to be optimized. It is simply the night and the dark and the quiet and your breathing, and whatever this actually feels like from the inside, which is already sufficient and has always been sufficient before any number was attached to it. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a kind of presence that does not announce itself. It does not fill the room before the person arrives. It does not require a display of what it knows or what it has achieved or what authority it carries. It simply is what it is, and the room arranges itself accordingly. Lao Tzu wrote that the best leaders are those whose people say, when something good is accomplished, we did this ourselves. The leader whose leadership was so genuine and so unforced that it left no trace of itself, only the result. This is pu, as it shows up in how a person inhabits power. The uncarved leader does not perform leadership. They do not manage impressions of themselves or remind people of their authority or signal what the correct response to them should be. They are simply, clearly themselves. And because they are simply themselves, people can be simply themselves in their presence. The leader who needs to announce their wisdom announces mostly their insecurity about it. The leader who does not need to announce it, who can sit quietly while others speak, and speak finally from genuine necessity rather than performance, carries something the announced leadership rarely achieves. Tonight's 10th teaching is this. The most significant presence is often the most quiet one, the one that does not insist on being noticed, the one that leads by creating the conditions for others to find themselves. There was a young chief who had newly inherited a position of leadership from an elder who was deeply beloved. He was capable, he was thoughtful. He had prepared for this role his whole life, studying under the elder who preceded him, paying careful attention to how decisions were made and communities were held together. But in his first year, something was not working. The community did not quite settle around him the way it had settled around his predecessor. People came to him with their questions, and he answered them carefully. But he could feel something in the exchanges that he could not name. A slight tension, a slight guardedness, a sense that the room had not fully relaxed. He went to an old woman in the community who had known many chiefs, who was not afraid to say difficult things, and asked her what she observed. She took her time before answering. "When you come into a council," she said, "what is the first thing you do?" He thought about it. "I greet everyone. I ask about the matter at hand. I often share what I've already been thinking about it." "What does your predecessor do?" she asked. He thought about this for longer. "He enters, sits, listens." "For how long?" "Sometimes a very long time," he admitted. "Long enough that I used to wonder if he was going to speak at all. And when he finally spoke, he said slowly, "it was usually the right thing, the thing that cut through, or the question that no one had thought to ask." "Yes," she said. "Do you know why?" He was beginning to understand, but he waited, because by the time he spoke, he actually knew what was needed, she said. He had listened until he understood, not until he was ready to perform his understanding, until he actually had it. "I speak too soon," he said. "You speak from where you started," she said, "before the room has had a chance to show you where it actually is." He tried, in the weeks that followed, to do what had felt, watching his predecessor, like passivity, but was clearly something else. He entered the council and sat. He listened while others spoke, not preparing his response, but simply following. He waited until something in the conversation called for him, rather than offering himself before the call arrived. It was harder than it sounded. Every time he held back a contribution, something in him insisted that this was weakness, that a leader should be visibly leading, that the silence would be mistaken for absence. But gradually, the room changed. People spoke more freely. Ideas surfaced that would not have appeared if he had shaped the conversation earlier. Solutions emerged from unexpected places, from people who had been too cautious to offer them when the chief was clearly already preparing his own answer. He noticed something else. He was less tired after councils now. The work of holding silence, of genuinely listening rather than compositely planning, was demanding in its own way. But it was a different kind of demanding, the demanding of attention rather than the demanding of performance. And when he finally spoke, he spoke from a place that actually knew what was needed, because he had waited until he genuinely did. One evening, after a particularly productive council, the old woman appeared at his side. "The room was different today," she said. "Yes," he said. "What did you do differently?" "Nothing," he said. And then he smiled, because this was actually true. He had done less, and that less had made more room. He never fully mastered the practice of speaking last. He was a person of active intelligence, and sometimes the intelligence arrived before the listening was complete, and he spoke from that incomplete listening. But he became, over time, a chief people could genuinely think in the presence of, not because he was imposing his thinking on them, but because he had learned to be present without filling the room before it had a chance to say what it needed to say. The old woman told him years later that his predecessor had learned the same lesson from his own predecessor, who had learned it from hers, in a long chain of people who had each discovered that the leader who waits speaks, ultimately with the authority of the room itself. In the African philosophy of Ubuntu, the concept of umuntu ungamuntu ungabantu, sometimes translated as a person is a person through other persons, carries a specific implication for how leadership functions in communities that genuinely hold this understanding. The leader in Ubuntu thinking is not separate from the community they serve. They are a product of it, dependent on it, accountable to its collective knowing. This means that genuine leadership in this tradition is not the imposition of a single superior will, but the creation of conditions in which the community's collective wisdom can surface and be heard. An elder or chief who spoke before listening was not being decisive. They were, in this understanding, being incomplete. They were making a decision from only a fraction of the available information, their own. The leader who could hold silence long enough to hear what the community actually knew, what the room was actually saying, was a leader in the fullest sense of that tradition. There is a specific practice in many southern African communities of the Indaba, a gathering in which every voice is heard before any conclusion is drawn, in which the youngest and oldest speak with equal respect, and in which the leader's role is often to listen most carefully of all. The wisdom of the Indaba belongs to the gathering, not to any individual within it, including, and perhaps especially, its leader. The young chief was learning, imperfectly, the simplicity that Ubuntu understands as the foundation of true authority. Not the simplicity of emptiness, but the simplicity of being genuinely present and genuinely open, rather than performing leadership at the room. Think about the rooms you enter and what you bring with you when you enter them. Not the ones where you are the obvious authority, the ordinary rooms, conversations with friends, family dinners, meetings with colleagues. What do you arrive with? A position already formed? A response already prepared? A version of the exchange already underway in your head before the other person has opened their mouth? You may have felt this yourself, the way full presence in a conversation is actually quite rare, because most conversation involves at least partial preparation for the next thing you are going to say, which means you are not quite fully in the thing being said to you. This shows up in ordinary life in the advice offered before the difficulty is fully described. The solution proposed before the problem is completely heard. The reassurance provided so quickly that the person expressing the difficult thing never quite feels they were actually received. There is also a smaller, quieter version of this that happens entirely with yourself. The way you arrive at your own quiet moments already full of what you are going to think next, so that the quiet never really has a chance to speak before the next thought arrives. Not, but right now, in this breath, there is nothing you need to contribute. The night is not waiting for your position on it. Simply be here in whatever way you actually are, without directing the experience toward a conclusion. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a richness in the ordinary that requires stillness to perceive. The day that is apparently the same as every other day, the familiar route walked 1,000 times, the meal prepared from the same few ingredients, prepared again. To the restless mind, these are tedium. To the quiet one, they are something else entirely, a depth that only reveals itself once the surface demand for novelty has quieted. Lao Tzu wrote about the sage who wanders without going far, who travels without leaving home. He was not describing poverty of experience. He was describing a quality of attention that transforms the familiar into the inexhaustible. The uncarved block is simple, but it is not thin. What looks like a piece of undifferentiated stone contains, if you pay attention, infinite variation in grain, in weight, in the way light moves across its surface in different weathers. The simplicity is real, and so is the depth within it. We have been trained to believe that a life worth living must be novel, must be accumulating new experiences, new places, new people, new achievements. But novelty, sought obsessively, produces a particular kind of poverty, the inability to be nourished by what is already here. The hunger that no meal satisfies. Tonight's 11th teaching is this: the ordinary day, fully attended to, contains more than any number of extraordinary days, half experienced. There was a fisherman who had fished the same bay for 60 years. He went out every morning that the weather permitted. He used the same boat, repaired and repaired and repaired until almost none of the original materials remained, though he would not have said it was a different boat. He used the same methods his father had used and his father's father before him. He came home in the afternoon, cleaned and sold the fish, ate his dinner, and slept. A journalist came to write about traditional fishing methods, and spent 3 days accompanying him. On the first day, she found him charming. On the second day, somewhat repetitive. By the third day, she was finding the sameness of his days almost oppressive. She asked him on the third morning, as they sat in the bay waiting for the fish to move, how he did not go mad with the monotony. He was quiet for a while, which he had come to understand was how he processed questions. "Show me 2 waves," he said finally. She looked at the water. "All right. Which 2? She pointed at 2. "Look at them." She looked. They were waves. Then she looked more carefully at how one moved differently through the shallower water near the rocks, how the other was slightly larger and caught the morning light differently, how they were both waves and not at all the same. "I have been watching waves for 60 years, the fisherman said. I have not yet seen 2 that were the same." She sat with this. "The fish," he said, "every day they are in different places. They behave differently in different weathers, different temperatures, different seasons of the year. The water is never the same. The light is never the same." He looked out at the bay with an expression she could not quite read, not sentimental, not proud, simply very direct. "To you it looks like the same day repeated. To me it is 60 years of days that were all different. I simply pay attention to what is actually here rather than what is supposed to be different." "Doesn't it ever get boring?" she asked. "When I am not paying attention," he said. "Yes, when I am thinking about something else, or worrying about something, or wishing I were somewhere different, then, yes, it becomes just the bay, just the fish, just the same. that when I am actually here, he paused. There is more here than I could see in a lifetime. She wrote her article. It was about the fishing techniques as planned, but she included a paragraph near the end about what the fisherman had said about waves, and that paragraph was the one people quoted back to her long after the rest of the piece was forgotten. She returned to her city and found, in the weeks afterward, that she was looking at things differently. Her regular walk to work, which she had always treated as dead time, the minutes between where she was and where she needed to be, began to be something else. She started noticing things she had walked past hundreds of times. A particular doorway, the way light came through a gap between buildings at a specific time of morning, the face of a woman who stood every day in the same spot with coffee, looking at something across the street. She asked the woman with the coffee one morning what she was looking at. "Nothing in particular," the woman said. "I just like this spot in the morning. Something about the light." The journalist looked at where the woman was looking. A completely ordinary stretch of pavement, lit at an angle she had never noticed because she had always been walking through it rather than standing in it. "I've walked past here every day for 3 years," she said. "I've never noticed the light." "It's only like this for about 15 minutes, the woman said, "and only in autumn." The journalist stood there for the 15 minutes. She was late to work. The walk did not become extraordinary, but she stopped being somewhere else during it, and that change from dead time to actual time was, she would say later, one of the more significant things that had happened to her that year. She thought about the fisherman who had found 60 years of different days in the same bay, and she thought he might be the most genuinely wealthy person she had interviewed. In Polynesian wayfinding traditions, there is an understanding of the ocean that corresponds closely to what the fisherman understood about his bay. Master navigators, who spent their lives on and around the sea, developed a relationship with the ocean that was not one of familiarity in the deadening sense, not the kind that stops seeing. It was a familiarity of deep attention, built over years of genuinely looking, genuinely listening, genuinely feeling. The ocean the wayfinder knows is never boring because the wayfinder has trained themselves, through long practice, to perceive its constant variation. The swell from the northeast is different today than it was yesterday. The color of the water near the horizon tells something different in this light than it told last week. The quality of the wind has changed in a way that is not dramatic, but is real and significant to the person who is paying attention. There is a teaching in these traditions that the navigator who has become bored with the ocean has lost something essential. Not the skill, perhaps, but the relationship. The ocean is always teaching. The question is whether you are still attending to the lesson. The fisherman was, in this sense, a kind of navigator, not of distance, but of depth. 60 years of returning to the same place and finding it inexhaustible. Not because the place was extraordinarily varied, but because the quality of his attention never settled into the half-presence that turns everything, eventually, into backdrop. There is a related Polynesian understanding of the relationship between practitioner and environment. that the deepest skill is not the ability to impose yourself on the environment, but to read it with sufficient attention that the environment itself guides the action. The ocean tells the navigator what to do. The bay told the fisherman where the fish would be. The attentiveness was the skill. Think about something in your ordinary life that you have stopped actually seeing. The route you travel every day, during which you are almost always somewhere else. The face you wake up next to, which you can describe in general, but have perhaps not truly looked at in some time. The meal you prepare from habit, while your attention is on something else entirely. The evening ritual that you go through the motions of without being quite present to it. You may have felt this yourself, the way familiarity produces a kind of glass between you and the thing you are supposedly experiencing. The city you live in, but no longer quite see. The body you inhabit, but never quite inhabit. This shows up in ordinary life in the experience of the veteran traveler who is everywhere but genuinely nowhere, collecting new places at such a pace that no place has time to become real. And in the equally common experience of the person who has stopped traveling, but also stopped seeing, who is in the same place every day, but not truly there. Not. But right now, in this breath, the moment you are in has never occurred before. This particular dark, this particular quiet, this particular body, this particular mind, at this particular edge of sleep. There will never be another one like it. It does not need to be extraordinary. It only needs to be seen. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a kind of knowledge that lives in the hands, not in the mind, not on the page, not in any form that can be fully extracted and passed on as information. It lives in years of repetition, in the accumulated sense of what right feels like before anyone can explain why it is right, in the way the dough should feel at a certain stage, in the way the wood sounds when the joint is close to fitting, in the way a person's face looks when they are about to say something they haven't planned. Lao Tzu wrote that the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. He was making a larger claim that the deepest knowledge is not the kind that can be fully articulated. It can be lived, practiced, demonstrated, pointed toward. But it exceeds language, and the attempt to reduce it entirely to language often reduces the thing itself. The uncarved block carries no instructions. No one has written on it what it should become, or how it should be worked, or what the correct angle of the chisel should be. All of that exists, if it exists anywhere, in the hands and eyes of the person who approaches it. We have become, many of us, suspicious of this kind of knowledge. We want what can be verified, measured, recorded, reproduced by anyone who follows the instructions, and this suspicion, which has real value in many domains, has also made us less trusting of what we know in our hands and bodies, the knowledge that the grandmother carried and could not quite explain. Tonight's 12th teaching is this: you know more than you can say. Some of the most important things you know live in your hands, your body, your accumulated years of paying attention. Trust them. There was a young woman who wanted to learn to make her grandmother's bread. The bread was famous within the family and among the neighbors. It had a particular quality, a density, a flavor, a specific kind of crust, that no one who had tried to reproduce it had quite managed to replicate. The young woman sat with her grandmother one afternoon and asked her to teach her. Her grandmother began making the bread. "How much flour?" the young woman asked, her notebook open. Her grandmother looked at the bowl. "Enough," she said. "But how much? In grams? In cups?" Her grandmother considered this seriously, as if the question were interesting but of unclear relevance. "Until it looks like this," she said, showing her the bowl. "How long do you knead it?" "Until it feels right." "What does right feel like?" Her grandmother took her hand and pressed it into the dough. "Like that," she said. The young woman felt the dough. It was smooth and slightly resistant, and had a quality she registered but could not name. "What temperature is the oven?" Her grandmother looked at the oven. She opened it briefly and held her hand near the opening. "Hot enough," she said. The young woman wrote, "Hot enough," then stared at what she had written. "Grandma," she said, "I can't go home and make this from these instructions." "No," her grandmother agreed. "You'll have to come back." She came back many times. She made the bread badly for 2 years. Too dense, too light, the wrong crust, the wrong flavor. Each time her grandmother watched without criticism, adjusting her hands occasionally, saying things like, "A little more," and "feel that," and "not yet." Then one afternoon the young woman made the bread, and it was right. Nick, she knew it was right before she tasted it. She had felt it while she was kneading, a quality she recognized but still could not describe, that had been registered in her hands and announced itself as yes. "How did you do it?" her grandmother asked. "I don't know," the young woman said. "I just knew." "Yes," her grandmother said, "that's exactly how I do it." She sat with this for a long time. She had made a loaf of bread and could not explain how. She could reproduce it. She discovered this over the following weeks, but could not convert the reproduction into instructions that would allow someone else to avoid the 2 years of bad bread. The knowledge was in her now. It had taken years to get there, and it lived in a place that words could not quite reach. She thought about this often afterward, about all the things she had learned this way through accumulated practice that lived in her body rather than her notes. Things she could do but not fully explain, things she knew but could not quite say. And she thought about the things she had not learned this way, had tried to shortcut with instructions, with measured steps, with reproduced technique, and how those things had a different quality, a hollowness, a slight distance from the actual thing she had been trying to acquire. She began to trust her hands more after that. Not blindly, she still read, still studied, still sought instruction, but she noticed when the instructions stopped being useful and the hands needed to simply practice. She became more patient with the years of bad bread that preceded the good loaf. She understood them, finally, as not a failure, but the shape of how embodied knowledge actually arrives. She thought, eventually, about how much of what she knew, genuinely knew in the way she knew the bread, had come to her this way, through repetition rather than understanding, through the hands before the mind, through the years of imprecise practice that preceded the moment of suddenly, inexplicably knowing. And she thought about how differently she had been treating the domains where she was still a beginner, how impatient she had been with herself for not understanding faster, for not being able to shorten the 2 years of bad bread in those other areas through sheer intelligence. The grandmother's recipe had no measurements, but it had something more useful: the certainty that the knowledge would arrive eventually in exactly the place it needed to be. In the Norse mythological tradition, there is a figure who sits at the very center of embodied practical knowledge: the craftsman, the smith, the person whose hands contain what cannot be taught through words alone. The dwarves of Norse mythology, the great craftsmen who forged the weapons and tools of the gods, are described in the old sagas as possessing a knowledge that is entirely practical and entirely embodied. There are no descriptions of dwarven libraries. Their knowledge is in their hands, in the accumulated practice of generations, in a relationship with material that produces things that cannot be produced by following instructions alone. When the god Odin received the runes, the symbols of a deeper kind of knowledge, he received them through ordeal, through 9 days of hanging on the world tree in the cold and dark, not through being told, not through being given information, through undergoing something that could not be shortcut, that produced knowledge no instruction could substitute for. There is a teaching in this tradition, carried in the understanding of craft as sacred, that the knowledge worth having is the knowledge that costs the body something to acquire, not in the sense of suffering necessarily, but in the sense of time, of repetition, of the gradual, irreducible education of the hands. The grandmother's bread, made the same way by the same hands for 60 years, contained this kind of knowledge. The young woman's 2 years of bad bread were the cost the body paid to receive it. And what arrived at the end was genuinely hers. Not borrowed from a recipe, but earned by her own hands, in a form that no one could take away, because it did not live anywhere that could be taken from her. Think about something you know in your body that you have never quite been able to explain. Not a mystery, a skill, a feeling, a sense for something that has developed over years of practice and cannot be fully reduced to instruction. The cook's sense of seasoning, the parent's sense of what this particular child needs right now. The reader's sense of when a sentence is finished. You may have felt this yourself, the frustration of trying to teach something you know deeply but cannot quite speak. The recognition in the student's fumbling of your own earlier fumbling before the knowledge settled into your hands. This shows up in ordinary life in the moments when you trust your hands more than your head and are right. In the moment you set aside the recipe because you know the dough. In the diagnosis that comes from years of looking at faces rather than from the checklist. In the decision that comes from the accumulated weight of a long experience rather than from any articulable reasoning. Not, but right now in this breath, your body knows how to rest. It has known since before you could speak. You do not need to read the instructions. You do not need to measure or optimize or monitor. You only need to trust what your hands and your breath and your body already know. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a quality of being that is available on ordinary days, in ordinary moments, that does not require clarity to be complete. The fog does not need to clear for the morning to be fully present. The unanswered question does not need to be resolved for the life that holds it to be genuine. The uncertain future does not need to declare itself before the person living toward it can be at rest. Lao Tzu wrote that the Tao is dark and undifferentiated, which is not a failure of the Tao but its nature. The deepest thing does not announce itself, it does not clarify on command, it is simply what it is, beneath all the attempts to illuminate it, available to the one who can rest in the dimness rather than demanding light. The uncarved block does not know what it will become. The not knowing is not its problem. It is simply itself, completely in the absence of any definition of itself. We have been trained to regard fog as an obstacle, to want always the clear view, the resolved situation, the arrived-at answer, and the demand for clarity, the refusal to be in the foggy morning without wishing it clear, keeps us out of the morning entirely. Tonight's final teaching is this: the fog does not need to clear. You can be here, in whatever this is, exactly as unclear as it actually is, and find that this, the actual present unresolved foggy now, is already completely home. There was a woman who had spent most of her adult life trying to understand herself. Not in the trivial sense, in the serious sense. She had worked with thoughtful teachers, read widely, spent significant time in reflection. She had made real progress. She understood herself considerably better than she had at 20 or 30. She could see her patterns more clearly, feel her responses more accurately, name what was happening in herself with more precision. But she had noticed, in recent years, a certain exhaustion attached to the project, and she had noticed something else, that even with all this understanding, there were whole regions of herself that remained persistently unclear, things she did not know why she did, responses that arrived without adequate explanation, feelings that refused to resolve into clean categories. She went to spend time with an elder she had known for many years, a woman who had, by any measure, lived with more integrity and care than most people she knew, and who seemed nonetheless comfortable with a great deal that was unknown in herself. "How do you do it?" she asked the elder on one of their walks. "How do you live so comfortably with the parts of yourself you don't understand?" The elder was quiet for a moment. They were walking in early morning, and a low fog lay over the ground in the places the sun had not yet reached. "Look at that," the elder said, nodding toward the fog. They stopped and looked. In the patches where the fog lay, the landscape was soft and indistinct. In the patches where the sun had come, it was clear and detailed. "Do you find the fog troubling?" the elder asked. "No," she said. "It's beautiful." "Why?" She thought about it. "Because it's what this morning is actually doing. The fog is the morning. If I wanted a clear morning, I should have come in the afternoon. But this is what's here." "Yes," the elder said. They walked a little further. "I have spent a long time," the woman said slowly, "treating the unclear parts of myself the way someone treats a foggy morning who wanted to see clearly, as though the fog were a problem." "And if it is not?" the elder asked. "Then it is simply what is here," she said. "The places in me that I don't see clearly. They are part of the landscape. They are the morning as it actually is." "I have lived for many decades," the elder said, "and I still do not understand everything about myself. There are things I do that I cannot fully explain, feelings I have that I cannot trace to their source, things that move through me that I can only observe, not analyze." "Does that bother you?" the woman asked. "Less and less," the elder said. "I have come to trust the fog, not because I have given up on understanding. I still pay attention, I still try to learn about myself, but I have stopped requiring the fog to clear before I can be at home in the morning. I keep thinking," the woman said slowly, "that if I understood myself enough, I would finally be able to simply accept myself, that the acceptance is waiting on the other side of sufficient understanding." "Yes," the elder said. "Many people believe this. I believed it too. And the understanding kept revealing new things to understand. The fog kept producing more fog. The acceptance that was supposed to come at the end never quite arrived, because the end never quite arrived." She paused. "Eventually I understood that I had been looking for the acceptance in the wrong place. It was not at the end of the understanding. It was inside the fog itself, available the whole time, to anyone willing to stop waiting for the fog to lift." The woman walked in silence for a while. The fog was burning off in places, slowly, as the sun rose. But the parts that remained were as beautiful in their way as the parts that had cleared. "I think I have been waiting," she said at last, "for enough clarity to arrive before I could fully accept being who I am. Some future version of myself who finally understands herself well enough to be at peace with herself." "Yes," the elder said, "many people wait for this. The peace they are waiting for was always available in the fog." She did not give up her inquiry into herself. She was too curious for that, and the inquiry was genuinely useful. But something changed in her relationship to the unknown parts, to the regions of herself that remained persistently unclear. She stopped treating them as problems to be solved. She let them be the fog in the morning, which was simply what this morning was doing, and which did not prevent the morning from being complete. She found in this permission something she had been working very hard toward for a long time and had not managed to achieve through working, an ease in her own presence, a quality of being at home in herself that did not depend on having fully understood herself first. The fog did not clear, but it became something she could rest inside rather than something she was standing outside of, waiting. Among Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the relationship between knowing and not knowing, between seeing clearly and moving through the unlit places, is understood in a way that is quite different from the Western tradition that surrounds it. In many Aboriginal traditions, the dreaming, often described inadequately as mythology or cosmology, but more accurately understood as the living, active, present foundation of reality, is not something that can be fully mapped or fully known. It is participated in, moved through, respected. But it exceeds any individual's comprehension, and the traditions are explicit about this. There is a teaching present in various forms across many Aboriginal nations about the kind of attention required to move through country that has not yet been fully revealed to you. Not the anxious, grasping attention of the person demanding clarity, the open, patient attention of someone who is moving through a landscape that will show itself as it shows itself, in its own time, in its own way. This quality of attention, what we might call comfortable not knowing or fog-dwelling, is not considered passive or resigned. It is a specific skill, developed over time, required for genuine participation in a living world that does not entirely submit to the demand for illumination. There is also a teaching about the relationship between the visible and the invisible in many Aboriginal traditions, the understanding that what cannot be seen is not absent, and that the person who can move respectfully through what is not yet visible is practicing a form of wisdom that the demand for clarity never achieves. The fog is not the absence of country, it is country as it currently is, which deserves the same attentiveness as country when it is clearly visible. The elder in our story was practicing something very close to this. Not the abandonment of inquiry, but the grounding of inquiry in a willingness to inhabit the foggy places without insisting they clear. The self that continues to pay attention even in the parts of itself it cannot see. Think about what you do not yet understand about yourself. Not a criticism, simply an honest recognition. The patterns you have not fully traced, the feelings that arrive without explanation, the recurring behavior that you have analyzed repeatedly and still cannot quite account for. You have probably been treating these the way someone treats fog, as a condition to be cleared before the real landscape can be seen, as though you must understand yourself completely before you can accept yourself fully. You may have felt this yourself, the particular relief of a day when things were clear, followed by the particular frustration of the foggy stretches that always eventually return, the sense that you are perpetually a work in progress, perpetually not yet finished enough to fully inhabit yourself. This shows up in ordinary life in the self-improvement project that never quite completes, in the self-knowledge that is always sufficient to reveal the next area of insufficient self-knowledge, in the waiting for the clarity that, when it arrives in one place, simply reveals new fog in another. But right now, in this breath, you do not need to see everything clearly. You do not need to understand all of yourself, or this day, or this season. The fog is not your failure. It is the landscape as it actually is, and you can be here in it, resting, breathing, completely present in the actual, unresolved, beautifully unclear now. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Tonight we began with the Uncarved Block, and over these 13 chapters we let that question open slowly from many different sides. We stood with the sculptor in the stone yard, trying to hold the block in its fullness before any tool was raised. We sat with the young woman by the river, remembering the quality she had before the world gave her a name for it. We watched the philosopher discover in an afternoon with his grandchild and the sky that reaching for the correct response was costing him the actual sky. We watched the dancer find in a quality of lamplight on a sleeve the absorption that her counting had been obscuring. We sat with the monk who had been failing to meditate for 9 years, and learned that what he had been calling failure was, all along, the plain and simple thing the practice was pointing toward. We heard the rabbi's empty sermon, and heard how what was not said filled the room with something more useful than what was planned. We ran a finger along the weaver's deliberately loose thread and felt something in it that the finished corners did not have. We sat in the park with the woman who put down the book about emotional regulation and simply watched a child run at pigeons. We walked through a mountain village with no clock and learned to feel when things were ready rather than being told. We sat in a council and watched a young chief discover the authority of speaking last. We watched the journalist look at 2 waves and begin, for the first time, to actually see the sea. We put our hands into the dough and felt the moment that could not be measured. And we walked in the morning fog with an elder who had long since made peace with the landscape as it actually was. Now, let us be clear about something. You are not your resume. You are not the version of yourself currently under construction. You are not the self-improvement project, or the achieved result of it, or the person still falling short of it. You are not what you have accomplished, or what you have failed to accomplish, or what you are in the middle of becoming. You are not the name the world gave you, or the role the world fitted you for, or the finished shape the world has decided to see when it looks at you. You are the sculptor before the chisel was raised. You are the stone in the yard. You are the fog that does not need to clear. You are the thread left deliberately loose in an otherwise finished piece. You are the plain, bare moment of simply being here, which has been present underneath all the carving, all the improving, all the performing this entire time. The teaching that has been circling tonight in 13 different rooms with 13 different voices is simply this. The uncarved block is not a lesser state. It is the most complete one, not the finished thing which has given up its becoming, but the whole uncommitted, still possible thing, which contains everything precisely because it has not been fixed into any particular shape. You were this once. You are still this underneath. The carving was real. The experiences, the lessons, the shapes the world carved into you, and it produced something genuine and worth having. But it did not destroy the block. the block is still there. This is not a teaching that can be mastered once and then maintained forever. The carving continues. New layers arrive. The world keeps wanting to improve you into some particular shape. The practice is simply returning as many times as necessary, without judgment for how far you had traveled from it, to the quiet, uncarved place. The place where you are not yet any particular thing, and therefore are still, in the deepest sense, everything. You do not need to remember everything you heard tonight. If one moment stayed with you, one phrase, one feeling, let that be enough. Wherever you are right now, you are welcome here. Exactly as you are, with whatever you are carrying and whatever you are ready to set down. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night.